You read about the orthodontist with over $1 million in student loan debt? The example seems totally unimaginable and preposterous. The gist of the Wall Street Journal article is that the orthodontist borrowed about $600,000 for his education. He then deferred while becoming specialized and is now in an income-driven repayment plan. It's projected that his debt will be over $2 million after 25 years of payment when he's due for forgiveness. Essentially, his monthly payments aren't even close to keeping up with his interest. There are a series of problems with the way we fund higher education that contribute to this $1 million scenario. And while this isn't common currently, there are about 101 borrowers out of over 40 million that owe over $1 million in student loans. This is going to be more common unless we fundamentally change the way we approach funding higher education and student loans. Instead of brushing this scenario off as the irresponsibility of a very few borrowers, I want to talk about how this super debt happens and how our system contributes to it. So stay tuned. Inelastic demand is the first problem in our system. The availability of federal student loans are directly correlated with the cost of tuition. As the amount of available student loans increase, so does tuition. In other markets, an increase in price would drive down demand. However, that's not the case with student loans. Despite tuition hikes, students continue to demand higher education. That means the demand for higher education is inelastic. It doesn't change based on price. Essentially, students have access to the money they need to pay for their education regardless of the price. And colleges know this, so they continue to raise tuition and fees, which leads to the second problem of perpetual tuition hikes. College tuition has increased at a rate well above that of inflation for the last several decades. In constant 2013 dollars, tuition and fees at a public four-year institution in 1980 were $2,147. 30 years later, tuition and fees nearly quadrupled to over $8,000 in 2013. In 30 years, the rise of tuition and fees exceeded the rate of inflation by almost 400%. But why are colleges and universities perpetually raising tuition and fees? This is the third problem, and that's reduced state funding. One of the factors for tuition hikes is continued reduction in state funding. Public universities obtain their funding from both federal and state sources. State sources of funding are primarily in the form of grants and can be applied for general appropriations, which means building new buildings, that kind of stuff. But federal funding is primarily in the form of student loans. In 1980, public universities received the majority of their funding from state sources. However, today, that has totally flipped on its head. Now, public universities receive the majority of their funding from federal sources. That means in order for colleges to continue funding their general appropriations at the same rate, they have to raise tuition and fees and pass that cost directly on to borrowers. Borrowers have more and more access to federal student loans, so borrowers are the one who immediately foot the bill for state budget cuts related to higher education. The most problematic degrees that lead to this super debt are not what you would expect. They're actually the highest paying degrees. It's most common to see something like this with medical graduates and dental graduates. It seems like an oxymoron. The best paying degrees can actually get you in the most financial trouble. But it's true. Degrees that tend to pay a lot on the back end tend to cost the most up front. In addition, predatory colleges enter the market that charge exorbitant fees in a sort of pay-to-play model where if you pay enough tuition, you can get the degree. The colleges offering these degrees will often tell the borrower they'll be able to pay back this debt no problem because they're going to have a good paying job when they finish. While it's true that these fields pay well, no W-2 employment pays well enough that a borrower can repay over $1 million in student loan debt without some type of loan forgiveness. Why do these things cost so much? Well, look at medical school. Medical school is a long haul. It requires 4 years of undergraduate education, 4 years in the College of Medicine, which is going to run a borrower at least $150,000 just for tuition and fees, let alone anything for cost of living. After 8 years of education, the medical student still needs to go to residency. And depending on how they want to specialize, that residency can take up to 5 years. And if that borrower decides that they don't want to struggle to repay their student loan debt on their small resident stipend, they might enter forbearance. and interest will accumulate for all those years while they're not making payments. That adds up really quick, which leads us to the fifth problem, high interest rates. Without high interest rates, super debt wouldn't be possible. But the average debt for unsubsidized student loans, which borrowers who have to take out more than $23,000 have to use, is over 6%. It's usually 6 to 7%. And the interest on those loans starts accruing the second the borrower takes that money out. So while they're still being educated in school, they're accumulating thousands of dollars in interest. If this interest continues to compound not only through the years of education required, but also during residency, it gets out of hand quickly. Then borrowers are almost forced to resort to an income-driven repayment plan, which then doesn't keep up with interest, and their loan balance continues to grow. That leaves huge loan amounts to be forgiven after 20 to 25 years of income-driven payments. Ultimately, all of this leads to an inefficient use of taxpayer dollars. Rather than funding our public universities up front so the cost to borrowers is less, we use taxpayer money to forgive debt that has had years of compounded interest added on. The most efficient use of taxpayer dollars is to fund education up front and decrease costs up front, rather than waiting until years and years of interest have accumulated and exponentially increase the cost of that original education. Ultimately, taxpayers are going to pay for higher education one way or another. Whether it's forgiving super student loan debts like this $1 million example, or providing funding for universities upfront. It makes sense to advocate for the use of our tax dollars to decrease the upfront costs of higher education. That way we at least get our money's worth out of spending instead of wasting money forgiving student loan interest. Have you heard of anyone with these levels of debt? We're not talking 6-figure debt, we're talking 7-figure debt here. Have you heard of anyone with that level of debt? If so, let me know in the comments below. If you guys liked this week's video, please give me a like and hit that subscribe button. There's a new video every Wednesday. We'll see you guys next week. Bye!